Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third annual academic convocation at East Georgia State College. I want to give a big thanks this morning to Dean Carmen Palumbo for organizing this event and to the faculty for selecting George Orwell's 1984 this spring as the topic for this event. That book was written, I'm sorry to say, just shortly before I was born, and it was written shortly after World War II had ended, when the whole world was wondering what might have happened had World War II turned out differently. I actually read the book for the first time in the early 1960s as a college freshman, as a high school freshman actually, and it had a really major impact on my worldview. In fact, the very first academic article that I ever wrote in my academic career was an article with 467 footnotes that addressed the issue of artificial monitoring of workers by their bosses. And what I'm hoping for all of you today that have the opportunity now to reflect on 1984 after the fact is that it will have just as much of an impact on your worldview after the fact as it did on my worldview before the fact. So thank you for participating in this discussion. And at this point, I'd first like to mention that Dr. Paul Fox was going to be next on the agenda. Due to personal reasons, Dr. Fox is unable to be with us this morning, but it's my real honor to turn the program over to Dr. Lee Cheek, who's Dean of Social Sciences at East Georgia State College. And Dean Cheek has had an extremely distinguished academic and military career. He earned his bachelor's from Western Carolina University, and then he earned his Master's of Divinity from Duke University. And then he went on to earn his PhD from the Catholic University of America. He's widely published both books and articles, and he's well known as a professor of political science and religion. And I'm pleased at this point to turn the program over to Dean Lee Cheek. You're in extremely good hands.
Thank you, Dr. Gambrell. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That wasn't very strong. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Praise the Lord. We're here today to discuss and to celebrate academic life. The convocation is a time apart. It's only an hour, so don't worry. We're not going to be here all day. We're still going to be able to go out and have fun and learn something today besides this. But it's an hour to think. It's an hour to reflect on what's so important about the lives that we live. We do a lot of important things at East Georgia State College, but our main mission, our main focus is learning. From the faculty perspective, our main goal is to turn you in to young scholars in search of the truth. Okay, here's what we're going to do. First today, we're going to have a little bit of a background. Then I'm going to make a few comments. And then we're going to turn over to our guest lecturer. So let me ask you, just as a favor, as your participation in the convocation, to turn off all electronic devices and just hang here with us for a little bit and be part of the conversation, because we have today as our convocation speaker, Dr. John Rodden, the world's leading scholar on our topic of George Orwell. So here you have a chance that you don't have very often in college to really, in your personal search for the truth, to ask somebody who is a very major figure any question you might want. Okay. This, ladies and gentlemen, is George Orwell. His great book that we're going to reflect on, and I'm going to introduce in just a few minutes, is 1984. But I should also, in the beginning, thank Dr. Bomer for bringing the notion of a convocation to East Georgia State College as a celebration of academic life, and to the Convocation Committee, as Dr. Bomer has noted, especially Dean Carmen Palumbo and the committee for organizing this great event. Thank you all. I think they deserve a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, George Orwell, 1984, groundbreaking book. Why read it? Well, it's a banned book. As we celebrated earlier this week, when I was in college, something being a banned book was enough of a reason to read it. It challenged the world of which I was part. There are similar books that challenge the world which you're part. One of them still happens to be 1984. In a survey when we began this new century, not the one all of us were born in England, they said, who was the most important writer in the 20th century in England? That guy Tolkien, you know, they made a few movies about his books, you know. He got first place. Orwell was second. In some ways, Orwell's probably more politically significant. Background, George was actually born in England. We're going to talk about that in a moment. We're going to talk about what's important about 1984, the changing of his life and his worldview in Spain. Spain had a civil war, which was a precursor to World War II in almost every regard. The purpose and the enduring influence. We're going to do this in about 6 minutes, so hold on. Those of you who have been my students know I move fast, talk fast, so get prepared. Somebody wake up Dean Brown. All right. Why read it? We talked about that already. It is a great classic. It's a great commentary on modern life, how a technological society can dehumanize those of us who are part of that society. Of course, we don't have to worry about that today, do we? NSA is listening to my conversation right now. He's got Strickland's phone number. All right. Background. Orwell was born in India. And if my prompter will work, if my prompter don't work, I'm going to be sent to India. His real name is Eric Arthur Blair. Born 1903. His father was an English civil servant working in the Indian colony. That's the day when we have colonies. We still talk about colonies today. In fact, his father was a lead officer in the opium department. I don't know what he did in his spare time, but he was a law enforcement officer. Orwell was not a great student, but he ended up under a King's Scholarship at one of the greatest public schools, which actually means private school in English educational life, called Eton. That prepares you for the civil service, leadership in the military, leadership in the academy. This is the Eton basketball team. Actually, I think it's the Lee cricket team, the Eton cricket team. And there's our friend George there. George didn't do well. He didn't graduate, but he read everything in the library. That's, by the way, if you're a young scholar in search of the truth, that's one way to do it, wherever you are. If you're in Nunez, if you're in Augusta, you're in Vidalia, you don't have the resources, you can read your way into a thoughtful, intelligent, productive life. That's why we push that in class, by the way. So he goes there, drops out. He goes, follows his father, goes to India, joins the Indian Imperial Police in what's called Burma, now Myanmar, and he's in charge of a big chunk of the country, hundreds of square miles. But he didn't like that. He wanted to be a writer. He called it his 5 wasted years. At the end of his life, he writes 2 books. You know both of them, probably not as deeply as maybe you can know them, or that I can know them as over time as well. Anybody heard of Animal Farm? Okay, what's it about? About animals? About who's in charge? Pigs? It's actually a book largely believed by critics to be written about life in the Soviet Union. Although it is getting close to lunch and I am thinking of pork. The other book that we talk about today, published in 1949, but doesn't really become popular in 1950. Orwell dies early in 1950 from tuberculosis. He never receives the fame. It is a powerful book with several key points, and Dr. Rodden is going to be addressing those points and other things, and you have a chance to ask him in a few minutes about those. One of those is love of country, patriotism, true patriotism, kind of in the Roman sense. Patriotism as love of country are the ideas, the enduring, most important ideas of any country, not simply the love of the country. You know, America, come Hades or high water. No. This idea of patriotism that Orwell offers is the love of the principles of the country. It may mean occasionally that you have to challenge your country to do what is very best and very noble and very much important to that political tradition. Secondly, disdain for ruling elites, academics, academic leaders like deans and presidents, vice presidents, really the managerial elite of the country, which he felt always tended to strengthen centralized power, to remove power and authority from the citizenry. And Orwell had a sense of equality that has set him apart from many other political thinkers. Lastly, an emphasis I want to mention as we turn to Dr. Rodden is in 1984, the crisis of the total state. Anybody read 1984? If you have not, go out and ask your boyfriend, girlfriend, mom, dad, somebody on the street to give you a present. 1984 makes a great present. About if government has too much power, what might happen? One of those things that might happen is that the liberty of the citizenry, you and me being able to do what we want, might be taken away from us. And 1984 is a prophetic, powerful warning about what can happen. But what can also happen to us today if we aren't vigilant about protecting our liberties. It's a dark story, but a powerful story. Spain, turning point, Spanish Civil War, 1936, 1939. It was Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was supporting one side. Hitler was supporting the other side. Starting to sound a little like World War II, isn't it? He fights in that war. He volunteers. The people who he thought he was fighting with end up shooting him in the neck. He was a sniper. He got shot by a sniper. He comes back and begins a great literary journey. This is 1984. It is a book for the ages. It's a book that can change your life and change my life. I want to take a moment now and transition and look at our speaker. Our speaker is the world's leading authority on Orwell. Dr. John Rodden, who has taught at many institutions, University of Virginia, University of Texas, and at a number of institutions in Asia. His PhD is from the University of Virginia, one of the great institutions for the study of English in the United States. He has published 25 books on Orwell. As we say, he's the real deal. And we are honored to have him today. He is not here in person because he had to be in Germany, but we are connecting with him via Skype. So I'd ask that you respect any kind of technological challenge that we might have, because we will overcome it. And you'll have the chance to ask him some questions afterwards. And I will be the interlocutor. But we might have a few glitches. We're connected to technology. But I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Palumbo and Joe Kennedy, who are going to connect us, and we'll begin our conversation with Dr. Rodden.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor to be with you this afternoon. I must say that the topic is also one that appeals to me very deeply. And I'm grateful for the Dean that he has explained to you very briefly the life of George Orwell. Because what I want to discuss with you is primarily the extraordinary, unprecedented afterlife of George Orwell. That is, the posthumous fame of this book, 1984, and of this author generally. So much so that his very name in adjectival form, Orwellian, has entered the political lexicon and the cultural imagination in numerous languages, becoming a synonym for sinister, nightmarish, even totalitarian and dictatorial. Now, the title of my remarks this afternoon are going to acknowledge this posthumous fame right up to today in the 21st century. That is, my title is How 1984 Went Viral. Well, that adjective was certainly not in use, and not in this sense, in the 1950s. And I want to explain the untold story of why everyone in this audience knows this book and even something about its author. And you are not alone, because around the globe, and here I am speaking to you from Germany, millions of people who have never even read 1984 know what that number means. It is not an ordinary number. By choosing that number as the title of his work, Orwell blackened a segment of time. No other author has ever done that. That is a feat of negative branding, as we might term it, that has no comparison. You've heard of four-letter words as blasphemy? This is a four-digit blasphemy. 1984. And very ironically, since you're familiar with the novel, let me point out that there is in the novel what is known as newspeak, in which words are gradually cut down and eliminated, so that something like superlative is double plus good, and horrendous is double plus ungood. You see, the vocabulary is meant to shrink and shrink and shrink because Orwell believed that language and thought are inextricably linked. And if you reduce the resources of language, you will reduce the capacity of human beings to think creatively and freely. And so Orwell, before he died, took pains with all of his editors and publishers to emphasize that the real title of the book was not 1984, as you have come to understand it today, but rather 1984, spelled out in words, 1980-4. So you see, one of the ironies is that the very title of Orwell's book has become a victim of newspeak. Newspeak, that is, it too has been abridged to these four numbers. So, 1984 went viral, but before I tell you that story, let me tell you what a phenomenon this really is. And of course, the irony again is that even as you have turned off all of your electronic devices, here I am communicating with you via the telescreen, as Orwell would have termed it. In Orwell's case, it was a one-way telescreen. Only the thought police and the inner party members could see what the populace was doing, including outer party members like Winston Smith and Julia. Here you and I have the opportunity to decide the extent to which electronic media, such as television, computers, and your iPhones will assist humanity or undermine it. So just imagine this now. 6 reasons why, as 1984 went viral, it has become bigger than any novel in history in terms of its influence. I do not maintain that 1984 is the greatest artwork that has ever emerged in the form of written prose, but rather that it is the most influential, and that George Orwell is actually a more influential author in history than even Shakespeare, Milton, Spencer, Dickens, and all the great predecessors of that kind. 6 reasons. Number 1, 1984 has become a novel that has skyrocketed to super sellerdom. More than 40 million copies are now officially in print, and countless millions more as underground in countries that have banned the novel, which I know has been a topic of your concern recently, this month. In fact, its super sellerdom has boosted copies of Orwell's other books, so that not a single work that Orwell wrote during his lifetime, which ended in January 1950, is out of print. And his complete works, every scrap of letter or note that can be found, has been published as the complete works of George Orwell in 22 volumes, available both in print, as hardback, and as paperback. Number 2, motion major pictures of all his books. Major movies of all his books. Number 3, immediately after the controversy in the mid-1950s about 1984, the story I'll tell you in a moment, 2 new television stations in Britain were born. That's like network television having been born. Almost like a YouTube video today would suddenly create Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and the Apple iPhone all at once. Can you imagine that? Number 4, imagine if that same YouTube video were suddenly now taken on by the CIA, the British intelligence services known as the IRD, secretly funded so they would be translated and adapted into film and TV productions in more than 60 languages around the world. That was another consequence of this story I'll tell in a moment. Number 5, the coinages in 1984 are known not only to almost everyone in the English-speaking world, but even to those in the non-Anglophone world, including here in Germany, as I discovered when I first lectured in East Germany, still a communist country, back in 1989, 1990. Der große Bruder sieht dich an. Big Brother is watching you. Thought crime. Doppelsinnigkeit. Thought criminal. Gedankenverbrechen. Doublethink, Zweidenken. And on, even his name in adjectival form. Orwellisch, which is Orwellian. How did these students in East Germany know what all this meant? Because the book had been banned. And what did they tell me? Well, we read it in the headlines in the Communist Party newspaper to describe your president, Ronald Reagan. Ha! He was Big Brother. And they said, you know, we even read about Margaret Thatcher. She was named Big Sister. Die große Schwester. So, that's number 5. And imagine number 6, equally important, that this YouTube video, this 1984, what happened to it in the mid-1950s and the 1960s, suddenly it became required reading in almost every public school in the USA and in the British Commonwealth, in places like Canada, Australia, even Africa and Asia, which were still part of the British Empire. Amazing. those 6 reasons, that's how 1984 went viral. That's the proof of it. But now let me just tell you the story briefly. And this is the story of the night of December 12th. We are passing through the 60th anniversary of how 1984 went viral in late December 1954 and throughout 1955. Briefly, the story is this. On that December 12th, 1954 night, 1984 was televised by BBC, the first time in history that the BBC had taken on a serious work like this. There was only one TV channel at the time, and this was the channel. It was on a Sunday night, and almost everyone in Britain was tuned in. It was the largest TV audience to that date, exceeding even the TV audience that had tuned in for the coronation of Princess Elizabeth to become Queen Elizabeth just a few months before. And of course, as we know, she's still the Queen of England. So this incredible event, which has been largely lost to history, it's practically unknown today, is what triggered 1984 becoming a household word. So, let me just tell you how this happened on that night. Why, apart from the size of the audience, was this book, now televised, suddenly something that went from being sold at 150 copies per week, very modest, that's only about 20,000 copies per year. Orwell was only known to a literate audience in London and New York, major metropolitan centers that value high culture works. But as the London Times later editorialized a couple of days later, the name Big Brother, which yesterday meant nothing to anyone in Britain outside of a few intellectuals, has today become a household phrase. The reason has not only to do with the audience size, because December 1954 was actually not the first example of 1984 being put on TV. It was the first example in Great Britain, but in late 1953, in the USA, NBC put on 1984 and attracted 8 million viewers, one of the highest audience sizes to that date. But it created no controversy. In Britain, it did. Let me give you a taste of this controversy by just reading to you a couple of excerpts from British national newspapers that were responding to the controversy that was erupting. You see, Sunday evening was usually an evening on the BBC channel for quiet reflection, family time. In fact, the program that came immediately after 1984, that evening, was the standard program, and the title of it was, "Come Thou Long-Suffering Jesus." Imagine the shock for people who might have been tuning into that program that entered it just a half hour early and were watching the adaptation of 1984. Here are a couple of the excerpts from TV, from the Daily Express. And remember, this is like the National Enquirer, but it's also very accurate. That is, this is the sensationalized tabloid press at the time, but nonetheless, these are real stories. A 40-year-old mother of 2 children collapsed while she was watching George Orwell's 1984. She was Mrs. Beryl Kathleen Murphy. Mrs. Murphy was a beauty queen in 1936. She was watching the play last night. With her was her husband. He is a real estate agent, and 2 friends. In the early part of Mr. Orwell's nightmarish fantasy of a police state future, Mrs. Murfin collapsed. The doctor was called immediately. He entered and asked, "She wasn't watching the TV play, was she?" That just gives you the flavor of what happened. People were watching this and dying. Here's another example of a soldier from World War II who was in the concentration camps, and what he was saying about it. The BBC cannot defend itself by warnings like appeared at the beginning of this show to children and old ladies that it would contain violence. I was a frontline soldier throughout the war and captured by the Nazis, and I have no regrets about my service. I do not think I can be charged with squeamishness, but I suggest there is a limit, and that Orwell and the BBC have overstepped this limit here. It was horrible filth, which suits the tastes of only the most sadistic type of viewer. Well, of course, it's these kinds of remarks that led to 1984 becoming banned in many places, in the schools, sometimes even from public libraries. Banned either because of its violence, which this soldier is regarding as horrific, that is, torture by rats in room 101, which happens to Winston Smith, these brainwashing techniques. Also, of course, banned because of the sex scenes. Winston and Julia. Julia is a faithful member, although obviously a hypocrite, of what is known in 1984 as the Junior Anti-Sex League. So here we have another irony. 1984 is banned in places like East Germany, where I had been visiting, because it is critical of socialism and communism. Obviously, Big Brother is primarily a stand-in for Joseph Stalin, who is the dictator of the Soviet Empire, communist Soviet Union at the time, but also banned in the West, in places like the US and even in Britain, because of parental and community objections as to its violence. So all this then creates an incredible controversy, and within weeks, the letter columns of magazines and newspapers are dominated by headlines about the controversy of 1984. One solution that is proposed is that Britain create 2 more channels, and that there be no confusion that the so-called serious channel, which would be reserved for works of high art like 1984, would be known as BBC One. But there would be 2 other channels, BBC Two, which would be an entertainment channel, and ITV, which would be for viewers with very special programming. So again, network television is born. All right, so let me just then conclude by telling you that there's so much more to explain with this story. But the whole point is that we often forget how and why books become famous, how and why people become famous, especially we English professors like myself. You see that books and authors are not simply part of some kind of heavenly sky, and because of sheer merit, sheer quality, are admired by everyone. No, it's often a perfect storm such as this, an accident of history that gets magnified and snowballed until suddenly not only viewer size, but all the controversies come together, including things as I've been just pointing out in the very beginning, like the CIA and other intelligence services secretly funding the books that becomes even better known in other languages and funding screen adaptations of it in film and TV. So, how 1984 went viral. It is the story of the night of December 12th. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I would also welcome any further comments or questions from the audience that perhaps the dean could field, and if there's time remaining and there's interest.
Thank you, Dr. Rodden. And we'll turn to our question section. I will serve kind of as the interlocutor. Please stand up, ask any question that you would like, and then I will communicate that to our sound booth, and Dr. Rodden will answer. So we'll start if you just stand up and identify yourself, and we'll get rolling. And don't everybody stand at once. Yes, ma'am. This is an excellent question. She asks, could Orwell have foreseen or anticipated the success, multifaceted success of 1984?
That is indeed an excellent question. And the simple answer is not in any way, shape, or form. He had no idea that the book that he was struggling to finish in mid-1949 would, within a few years, become the most influential book in modern history, and that the very coinages in the book would come into circulation in numerous languages. I might even also point this out, because again, here it's one of the other accidents of history, that if Orwell had died even 8 months earlier, remember he died in January 1950, the book 1984 was published in June 1949. If Orwell had died in the spring of 1949 with the book left incomplete, my argument is that he would be largely unknown today. Animal Farm was a successful book, but Orwell probably would have been dismissed by most experts as a one-book author. Except for a couple of catchy phrases, Animal Farm did not launch any catchwords into the language. So Orwell had no idea about the extent that 1984 would influence both Western and non-Western culture within just a few years of his death, 4 to 5 years of his death. What I should also point out, however, is that there are many critics of Orwell who insist that he should have known how 1984 would have a disastrous impact in some ways, that it was a dangerous book. What one critic, right after the appearance of the TV broadcast in 1954, pointed out that 1984 was about to become an ideological superweapon in the Cold War of words. That is, although people didn't know it, it was quite obvious that governments in the West, if not the CIA and the IRD themselves, were very, very, very happy that battle-tested slogans like Big Brother, thought crime, doublethink were all being applied to the communists because the Cold War was heating up by the 1950s. Should Orwell have known? Should he have anticipated all this? That's what some critics on the far left, usually Marxists sympathetic to the Soviet Union, have pointed out for many decades. And that criticism has never gone away.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Any other comments or questions?
Desmond, Professor Purcell. This is a great question from Professor Purcell. Concerns when Orwell left Eton, the super-duper prep school. He spends his 5 years in Burma with the Indian police. and was in charge of a great area and had a good bit of control, how might that experience influence his social and political views?
Orwell once said, half seriously, "When I see a confrontation on the street between what seems to me an ordinary citizen and a police officer, I do not hesitate to know immediately whose side I am on." And he, of course, meant the side of the citizen. You might say that that is a very, very relevant statement to charges in the U.S. that have also gone viral in the last couple of years about police harassment and police brutality. That is, Orwell did indeed serve 5 years in the Indian Imperial Police, which was the civil service that was set up by the British Empire in Asia. And Orwell served in Burma, which at the time was part of the Indian Protectorate in the British Empire. He did not attend any university. He went to a very special, elite school, a private school, which the British have always called the public schools, Eton, but then chose instead not to go to a university, unlike almost every other significant writer and intellectual of his generation and before or since that time. One of the very rare examples of someone who decided that he wanted to go his own way. And the way that he went was to become a police officer. Did this have any influence on the novel? Clearly it did in some respects. That is, Orwell knew what it was like to serve in the police, and he also knew the dangers of authority, of power. And so the thought police are, in some respects, aspects of the very kind of brutality that he felt that he himself had engaged in as a police officer. He wrote one of his most moving essays, Shooting an Elephant, in which he felt that, and it's largely an autobiographical essay, in which he felt that he had overstepped his authority, killing an elephant, and that elephant was almost like a stand-in for a human being. In another essay titled A Hanging, he talks about how he and other officers observed a hanging and with complete indifference, as if this wasn't even a human being. And immediately after the official hanging, they all went to the club and had a round of drinks and laughed about how the prisoner didn't seem to die immediately. His legs were shaking for several seconds after the hanging. I should point out, however, that the deepest imprint that Orwell's police service had upon his literary life took the form of a novel that was published right after he came back from his service in Burma, and it was titled Burmese Days. And in that work, you can see the way in which he felt that the militarism, colonialism, jingoism of the British Empire had a disastrous effect on the morale, on the ethical qualities of the British officers like himself who served there. All his life, Orwell was anti-authoritarian and very worried about the likelihood that power corrupts. And of course, probably the most obvious example of that warning is Animal Farm, in which the pigs are in control.
Thank you, sir.
Any other comments or observations or questions?
Next question. Yes, sir. Dr. Bowman? Thank you, sir. If Orwell were to write 2034 today, what might that book argue or conclude?
Let's see, the title that you're proposing is 2034, 2034?
Yes, sir.
I see. Well, of course, that is 19 years beyond today. What I should point out is that Orwell chose the title 1984 because he was writing what is known as an anti-utopia. That is, from the inside, 1984 looks to a lot of people like it's a good society. Certainly to the party members, for the most part, and even to the populace at large, because they're brainwashed. They love Big Brother. That's the last line of the novel. Of course, from the outside, we as the readers, and of course rebels like Winston and Julia, can see that it is an anti-utopia. Orwell completed the book, largely, except for some revisions, in late 1948, and he flipped the digits. That is, he was imagining a world 36 years in the future, 1948 to 1984. When the book was published in 1949, of course, that was 35 years. And he then later said that essentially what he was doing was trying to imagine what his grandchildren might have to experience if they were to live in the year 1984. Now, what we need to remember, marking the differences between the 21st century and when Orwell was writing in the mid-20th century, is this. Orwell was writing in the immediate aftermath of the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis in 1945. As he was composing the book, the war was still raging. He was a correspondent in Germany as American and British troops were entering the country in occupied Germany in the spring of 1945. He was seeing up close what happened with the Nazis in the concentration camp. In 1949, Joseph Stalin and the communists were moving to occupy practically all of Eastern Europe and beginning also to make inroads into Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. Of course, we know today one of the places in which they made very severe inroads and became a communist dictatorship is Cuba, which the Pope has just left. So Orwell was writing in the shadow of totalitarian dictatorships that had a brutality and a severity unknown today. If we are imagining a world 19 years hence from today, how would Orwell rewrite his novel? How would he imagine it differently? I believe I've already gestured in that direction. That is, we do not have any big brother dictatorships. We have, let's say, little brother dictatorships. We have ISIS. We have President Assad in Syria. We have North Korea. We do not have any nations such as the Soviet Union, which consisted not only of Russia, but of all the other countries that Russia had occupied and dominated, countries that are now free, like the Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and on and on and on. Despite the resemblance in some ways of Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Putin. All right, so I don't think Orwell would so much emphasize the totalitarian power of repressive regimes, but rather the potential repressive and oppressive power of our technology.
And the other
It has the potential to dominate us and utterly claim our minds like Room 101 and the thought police. I think he put much more emphasis on the way in which we as digital natives, you above all, you're the generation of digital natives. I'm really a dinosaur by comparison. I'm part of the birth of the electronic age back in the TV era. I'm really not even part of the middle generation, that is the computer generation of your parents. So I think Orwell would put much more emphasis on technology and the great possibilities as well as the great dangers. One of his observations was this. You may remember that the Wright brothers invented the airplane in the USA, in North Carolina, in 1903. Within 11 years, what had become of the plane? It was being used to drop bombs during World War I. It is, Orwell observed, almost as soon as we develop a wondrous new technology, what happens? We find ways to abuse it. And of course, the same thing was happening with television, with his own novel. TV had been born as a widespread phenomenon in the home only around 1950. And here we see that within a few years, it is causing people to die in their own homes watching something that they find far too sickening and violent on a Sunday evening, as they're expecting to see a program like Come Thou Long-Suffering Jesus. So I think there'd be a shift from the political to the technological in his imagination of the year 2034.
Thank you, Dr. Rod. And of course, the big question about the novel 2034, would Donald Trump still be president? We just have a few minutes left, and we have one final question.
One or two questions, beautiful.
So, but one final question. Anybody have a question? Well, we'll offer one on behalf of our student body, which is, like many of us, very attached to technology. In 1984, Big Brother uses technology to control the population of Oceania. We are very familiar with technology and the use of technology to broadcast almost everything, including your presentation today. What do you think Orwell would have thought of these advancements in technology and the effect of this on individual privacy?
Yes, I tried to deal with some aspects of that a moment ago. But let me just briefly address it in a more concentrated fashion. I think Orwell would have been delighted and impressed by the demographic extent and indeed the democratic aspect of the internet. That is, so much of it is available essentially for free to people all around the globe. And even courses like the MOOCs, the so-called MOOCs, these courses that are now being made available by many universities that are simply designed to promote learning without any charge of fees, so on and so forth, or very modest fees, something that he would have found wonderful. On the other hand, I think he would have also acknowledged that we have become a society in the U.S., and this is spreading throughout the world, of exhibitionists and voyeurs it's no secret that 60, 70, 80% of what is on the internet is in some fashion pornographic and or violent. Of course, we also know that as a result of scandals associated with the NSA and other intelligence services, not only in the US, but here also in Europe, one of the scandals that recently emerged after it was publicized that the US had been listening in secretly to Angela Merkel's, the Chancellor's emails and voicemails, was that, well, the Germans were doing that themselves, if not to the US, to plenty of other countries. So invasions of privacy, not only by companies, but by government, are far greater encroachments on our liberty than could ever have happened before with more modest technologies. So I think Orwell would have seen this as a two-edged sword. And he would have applauded the way in which the computer and its offspring, advanced technologies, have widened our capacity to communicate and given us more freedom to learn in new ways, and so on, but also deplored that these same technologies had limited our freedom and turned us into zombies that are easily seduced by what is on the internet.
That's
just like what I mentioned a moment ago that happened with the airplane. As soon as these technologies get developed, human beings, being human beings, fallen creatures, find some way not only to use them for our benefit, but to abuse them to our potential destruction.
Let's take a moment and thank Dr. Rodden again.
Thank you so much for your time and attention. It's been just a wondrous hour with you, and I'm extremely gratified to have had the opportunity to talk with you about these important issues, and hope that you have a great year in exploring this book and this author in ways that go far beyond what we've been able to do this afternoon. And congratulations to all of you at this academic convocation. Best wishes.
Thank you. On behalf of East Georgia College, State College, a contribution has been made to the Sisters of St. Joseph the Worker involved in helping children in inner cities of India, and we're also donating the works of Dr. John Rodden to the East Georgia State College Library. Thank you very much. This concludes our event. Thank you, sir.